Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 107, Eugenia Fallini. An Italian immigrant, Eugenia Fallini, lived as a man for years, married and was convicted of her wife's murder in Sydney in the 1920s. According to family accounts, Eugenia Fallini was born on the 25th of July 1875 near Livorno, Italy. Eugenia was also known as Lena Fallini, Nina Fallini, Eugene Fallini, Eugene Martello, Jean Fallini, Harry Leo Crawford, Jack Crawford and Jean Ford. Eugenia was the eldest of 22 children, of whom 17, 10 boys and 7 girls, survived. She migrated with her family to Wellington, New Zealand in around 1877 at the age of 2. Her father, a stern disciplinarian, worked as a carrier with a horse and cart and as a fisherman. She frequently ran away as a child, seeking jobs in brickyards and stables where she dressed as a boy. When a teenager, she left home in the guise of a cabin boy on board a Norwegian barque. By her own account, her gender was discovered on board the ship, and she was put ashore, pregnant, in Newcastle, Australia in 1898. In the same year, she gave birth to a daughter, Josephine, in Sydney, and put the child into the care of an Italian-born woman in Double Bay, and afterwards took on a male identity as Harry Leo Crawford, saying she was of Scottish descent. Crawford worked in Sydney for employers who thought nothing of the gruff, taciturn men's bearing, and from now on I'm going to refer to Eugenia with the pronoun he. He held a series of manual jobs in a meat factory, hotels, laundries, a rubber company and in private service. By 1912, he was a yardman and a driver for Dr. G.R.C. Clark of Wahroonga, where he met Annie Burkett. Annie was a widow with a 9-year-old son, and Annie was a general domestic for the Clarks and had saved a nest egg. Harry took mother and son on sulky rides and visits to the circus. The courting pair resolved to leave service and set up a confectionery shop in Balmain. Claiming to be a widower aged 38, the son of a master mariner, and named Harry Leo Crawford, Harry went through a marriage ceremony with Annie on the 19th of February 1913 at the Methodist Parsonage, Balmain South, and they embarked on a brief, stormy family life. It remains unclear whether Annie realised that her husband was not a man. Neighbours later reported that the pair quarrelled frequently, particularly after Fallini's daughter, Josephine, reappeared. While Annie's son, Harry, was away from home, on September 28th, Crawford persuaded her to go for a picnic with him. A neighbour saw them depart, Crawford carrying a picnic hamper in a wicker basket, but Annie Crawford never returned. Apparently, Annie had threatened to reveal her husband to the authorities for his deception, and the couple quarrelled. A few days later, on the 2nd of October, a woman's body was discovered, charred beyond recognition and apparently battered. Her body was accidentally found in the remains of a fire in the bush near Mowbray Road, Lane Cove. And the article reporting this find: Chatswood. About 10:30 a.m. on the 2nd, the dead body of a woman, name unknown, was found in a charred condition in the bush off Mowbray Road, Chatswood, and at an adjourned inquest held before the acting city coroner on the 31st, the following verdict was returned: that the said woman, name unknown, was found dead in the bush off Mowbray Road, Lane Cove, in the district of Sydney, on the 22nd of October 1917, with certain marks of violence appearing upon her body. I further find that she died on or about the 1st of October 1917, at the same place, from the effects of burns caused through her clothing catching fire, but whether accidentally or otherwise, the evidence adduced does not enable me to say. A hideous aspect was lent to the case by Dr. Palmer, who declared that in his opinion Annie Burkett was alive when her clothing caught fire or was set on fire. Near the remains, which were those of a woman about 40 years of age and 5 foot 7 inches tall, were found a broken whiskey flagon and the ashes and locks of a Japanese wicker suitcase, similar to the one carried by a woman who appeared somewhat demented, seen frequenting the locality for about a fortnight previously, who was probably identical with the deceased. Harry Crawford did not report his wife missing. Rather, he claimed that she had left him. Josephine moved out, and selling the household goods, Harry moved to inner Sydney with his stepson. On the 29th of September 1919, at the Canterbury Registry Office, Harry Leo Crawford, widower and mechanical engineer, married Elizabeth King Allison. The groom's parents were listed as Harry Crawford, shipowner, and Elizabeth Fallini. Also in the intervening time, Annie's son had alerted the police to his mother's prolonged disappearance. The body of Annie was exhumed and identified, and Harry was arrested on the 5th of July 1920. Detectives went to the Empire Hotel, Annandale, and arrested Crawford. They took him to the police station and charged him for murdering his wife Annie Burkett 3 years prior. Crawford asked, "What happens when you go to jail?" And they said, "One of the first things that will happen to you will be that you'll get a good government suit and a darn good bath." "Well, in that case, I want to go to the women's ward." And Robson said, "You can't go there." "Yes, I can," said Crawford, sullenly, hunching down in his ancient working clothes. "I'm a woman, not a man." As the startled detective continued to question him, Crawford placed his hands to his head, saying, "Oh, this is a terrible thing. It has been a worry of my life. I don't want you to let my wife know." "Your wife? You mean she doesn't know?" asked Robson. Crawford shook his head. He then revealed to police that his real name was Eugenia Fallini. He'd been born in Florence, Italy, on the 25th of July 1875. He said that he'd commenced the masquerade 22 years before in Newcastle, following an affair with a ship's captain named Martello. Robson asked, "Your first wife, did she find out you're a woman?" He said, "I think she found out in the latter stages of our married life. Somebody had been talking." Fellini told detectives she had lived as a man because women worked longer hours for smaller wages. By working as a man, she worked shorter hours for a better wage. Among the male clothing in a locked leather suitcase, police located an article, later exhibited in court, made of wood and rubber bound with cloth in the shape of a phallus or dildo. On the 6th of July 1920, in the papers, an Annandale sensation: woman masquerading as a man, arrested for alleged murder. Eugenia Fallini, aged 45, who was dressed as a man, has been arrested at a hotel in Annandale, where she was employed as a general useful, and charged with having murdered Annie Burkett, or Crawford, with whom she went through a marriage ceremony in 1917. It is stated that the accused married Burkett under the name of Harry Crawford. The latter's charred remains were found in the bush at Chatswood in October 1917. At the inquest, an open verdict was returned. The accused will appear at the police court today. And it says that Eugenia Fallini, the woman who dressed as a man, was remanded on the charge of feloniously and maliciously murdering Annie Burkett. The press at the time relished the revelation. Sydney's man-woman created a sensation, and at his preliminary hearing in July 1920, the defendant appeared in men's clothes. The Melbourne Herald covered an article on the 6th of July 1920. It's titled "Charged with Murder, Italian Woman Described." Sydney on Tuesday. There was a large crowd in the Central Police Court this morning when Eugenia Fallini, an Italian woman who was alleged to have gone through a form of marriage with another woman, was presented on a charge of having murdered Annie Burkett on or about the 1st of October 1917. The accused woman was strangely interesting. She bore an extraordinary resemblance to a man, for facially she is masculine and she wore male clothing in the dock. She appeared distinctly nervous. She wears a gold band ring on the little finger of her left hand, visible as she fiddled with the dock rail. In her right hand she carried a grey felt hat. Her hair is almost black. It is clipped short, of course, and is neatly brushed and parted on the left side. Her head and face are remarkably small, the face being particularly round. Her mouth is considerably wrinkled and suggests that she's older than her stated age. Her complexion is sallow and her small eyes are brown. The woman's clothing consists of a well-worn dark grey cloth sack suit, white tennis shirt and neatly tied green Broadway tie. Well-polished boots seem to be about size 6 and were of patent leather with dull uppers. Fallini is of medium build. On the application of Police Sergeant White, a remand until the 14th of July was granted, and Mr Jennings SM and Mr Maddox Cohen appeared for the accused and said that he would make the application for bail. On the charge sheet, it was set out that the woman was also known as Eugene Martello, Harry Crawford and Harry Leon Crawford. In the Zeehan and Dundas Herald, paper in Tasmania on the 8th of July 1920, an article titled Woman Charged with Murder, Remarkable Career of Accused. In Sydney, amazing particulars are supplied by the police in connection with the arrest on Monday evening of a woman named Eugenia Fallini on a charge of having murdered Annie Burkett or Crawford on December the 1st, 1919, a brief reference to which was made yesterday. Fallini is a native of Italy, 45 years of age. She married in Italy to a man named Martello Fallini, and a daughter was born of the marriage. They went to New Zealand, but after living there some years, the woman left her husband and daughter and came to Sydney. She assumed male attire and obtained employment. For a while she lived at Wahroonga on the North Shore line. There it seems she became acquainted with the woman Burkett and went through a form of marriage with her at Balmain under the name of Harry Crawford. Burkett was a widow who had a son who is now 17 years of age. About 3.5 years ago, the charred remains of a woman were found in the scrub near Chatswood. At the coroner's inquest regarding the death of a woman, name unknown, an open verdict was returned. On Easter Monday, young Burkett came home from Collaroy and found his father sitting at the kitchen table muttering. Beside him was a bottle of whiskey. The next morning, Crawford was still there and the bottle was nearly empty. Young Harry Burkett, then 17, inquired where his mother was and was told she'd gone to stay with Mrs Murray, a friend of hers at North Sydney. In the weeks that followed, Crawford sold their furniture and told friends and neighbours that his wife had left him again. He then moved to Cathedral Street, Woolloomooloo, with Harry Burkett. Twice Crawford tried to murder Harry. Once he took him on a wild excursion through scrub at Double Bay and made him dig his own grave during a severe storm, but Harry escaped him. Another day he tried to induce Harry through the safety fence at the Gap. When the papers reported the discovery of a woman's charred and unrecognisable body in the scrub at Mowbray Road, Lane Cove, Crawford, who could neither read nor write, asked Harry to read the details to him. He also asked another friend to read the story and exclaimed, "That's her." Subsequently, the lad went into lodgings at Woolloomooloo. Quite recently, he went to an aunt and told her things which led to an interview with the police. Fallini was arrested at a hotel at Annandale. She is still in man's clothes. In November last, Fallini went through the form of marriage with another woman. Fallini was remanded until the 16th of August. The police stated that they had to get an important witness from Coffs Harbour and also undertaking further inquiries. Fallini's lawyer said he hoped the police would expedite the charge, as Fallini has been before the court 4 times and did not wish to be paraded repeatedly in court. Sergeant Spire said he would do all he could to have the case proceeded with on the 16th of August. So in the Melbourne Herald on Wednesday, the 18th of August 1920, Fallini murder trial, landlady's evidence. Sydney on Wednesday. Mrs. Schleiblich, a German, gave her evidence with the assistance of a government interpreter, and she said that she had been living in Cathedral Street for 26 years. She said that Fallini came to her 2 or 3 days after the discovery of the body and asked for a room containing 2 beds. He was given a room. The day after he went to her place, he was accompanied by his stepson. Fallini seemed to me as if he was extremely excited and half mad. He asked her that if the policeman came to say that he did not live there. Mrs. Scheidlich added that Fallini told her that he had a row with his wife, that he had given her a crack on the head and that she had cleared out. It appeared that Fallini startled her Woolloomooloo landlady one morning when she ran out of her room crying, "Madam, madam, I am haunted, my room is haunted." The witness said, "I think your wife is haunting you. I think you killed her." Fallini replied, "What did you say that for?" Crawford's odd behaviour was terrifying his landlady. He threatened to kill Harry. Finally, the landlady threatened to call the police and Crawford left immediately. In the Zeehan and Dundas Herald in Tasmania on Thursday the 19th of August 1920, the mystery woman, murder charge heard, evidence of victim's son. Police Constable John Walsh gave evidence to the finding of the remains of a woman in scrub near Lane Cove River on the 2nd of August 1917. The only clothing found was a piece of gabardine, black stockings and a pair of shoes. Near the body were the remains of a quart flagon, an enamelled mug and a glass, also a small kidney-shaped piece of green stone. There were also some loose teeth from a set of false teeth, a flask and a set of upper false teeth. Dr. John Felix McManus, dentist of Balmain, deposed that in 1918 a woman named Burkett went to him to have a lower set of teeth made. The loose teeth produced were similar to those that he supplies. Dr. Harry Gordon Vernon said a Mrs. Burkett went to him in 1910 and he made her a full upper and lower denture. He believed the dental plate on the upper was of his manufacture. Mrs. Lily Nugent, residing at Blakehurst, said Mrs. Burkett was her sister. She was married to a man named Crawford in 1914. She had been previously married and had a son. She last saw her sister in June or July 1917 and recognised the defendant and the chain produced as her sister's, also the greenstone pendant with the chain attached. Harry Bell Burkett, an intelligent young man, said he was a tailor's apprentice. He had no recollection of his father, who died when he was about 3 years of age. About 1914, his mother left Dr. Clark's, where he and she had been for about 6 years. About 1912 was when he first saw the accused, and he was employed at Dr. Clark's as a useful. After we left there, the accused persisted in worrying my mother so much that she practically had to marry him. While they were at Balmain, there were always rows. They were not happy. My mother used to drink a glass of ale brought in by Fallini. I never saw my mother under the influence of any drink. After leaving Balmain, my mother and I lived at Kogarah. Fallini often came there. My mother did not want Fallini coming about there. He used to worry my mother and wanted to straighten things up. At Austral Street, Kogarah, Fallini came and lived with us. Again, there were more rows, and one big one I remember. The accused this time smashed many a thing up. Fallini got a job at Pedrio's at Drummoyne, and we went to live at the Avenue, Drummoyne. On the Saturday preceding 8-hour day, 1917, I went away with a Mrs. Bone, the wife of my employer, to Collaroy Beach and returned on the following Monday night, which was 8-hour day. I reached home shortly after 8:30 p.m. Fallini was there sitting at a table with a glass and a bottle of Walker's whiskey. The bottle was between half and 3/4 full. Fallini looked as if he had been drinking, and I said to him, "Where is my mother?" Fallini answered, "I don't know." I asked him again and he said, "She has gone away with some friends to North Sydney." I then went to bed. Fallini asked me to have some whiskey. In the morning, the accused got the breakfast, though he had not gone to bed. In the morning, Fallini took him to the Circular Quay and from there to Watson's Bay. Out there, continued the witness, we went up on the cliffs. Fallini got outside the fence and asked me to come with him. I stayed on my side of the fence. His manner towards me was less pleasant than usual. He started throwing stones down into the water and asked me to come and do the same. He remained doing that from quite near the edge of the cliff for about 3/4 of an hour. Then Fallini got back through the fence. He seemed to be always thinking. We came back to town and he took me to a residence in Paddington and left me there. Some days after, he took me to Woolloomooloo and stayed there for about a week. While there, he brought me a newspaper and asked me if there was anything about a murder at North Sydney in the paper. There was a photo of a pair of shoes, and Fallini, who could neither read nor write, asked me if there was anything written about them. This would be about a week or a fortnight since I had seen my mother last. Fallini was sleeping in the same room as me and was very restless and talked in his sleep. One night he said to me, "Come along," and we went out. He went back and got a brand new shovel that had never been used. It was thundering and lightning and teeming with rain. We went in the tram to Ocean Street and, getting out, went down Bellevue Road and over to a vacant piece of scrubby ground. He was in front of me and I always seemed to follow on. At this stage, Mr. Cohen, who appeared for Fallini, formally objected to evidence given regarding the visit to Bellevue Hill on the ground that it happened after the death or the supposed death of Annie Burkett. Mr. Gale said, "Of course, it represents a state of mind of the accused at the time, and in that respect it is relevant. I will admit it at this stage." The witness continued, saying, "We then went into the scrub into a piece encircled by trees. Fallini dug a hole 4 foot square and 3 foot deep. He then asked me to dig. I dug for some time and getting tired, I got out of the hole. Fallini went in, dug out a few shovelfuls and then got out. While I was digging, Fallini was drinking brandy from a small flask. He did not say anything to me. I did not ask him what the hole was for because I was tired of asking him things as I never got any satisfaction. We wandered into the bush for about 5 minutes. It was thundering and lightning and raining. I had no overcoat. We came to a sandy flat and the accused commenced to dig again. I started to dig and Fallini told me to stop. He threw the shovel into the scrub, caught a tram and arrived home. The boarding house keeper took my clothes, which were soaked, and dried them. A few days later, the accused took me to another place in Cathedral Street, and since then I have seen little of the accused. A pair of shoes was shown to the witness, and in a subdued tone of voice, it seemed with a catch in his throat, he said, "They are my mother's. The patches on the soles were put on by the accused." Several articles of jewellery were shown to him, and again he said, "They were my mother's too." An enamel mug he recognised by certain marks as having been his mother's property. They did not live happily for long after the marriage. It was a matter of weeks. They would quarrel no matter who was there. They would row in the shop. He was asked, "Had the accused been cruel to you or chastised you?" And he said, "He never had much to do with me. He treated me with contempt. He's never been cruel to me." Mrs. Carroll, residing at Longueville, said that on Friday, September 28, 1917, she went to the paper mill at Longueville, and on the way there, not far from where a body was found, she came suddenly upon a man standing by a rock near a hill with his head buried in his hand. He appeared to be excited and started at the appearance of the witness. On her way home, she again saw the man. He jumped over a rock and walked behind her for about 6 minutes, until he came to another track. The man in the dock was the one that she saw at Longueville. The hearing was adjourned till Wednesday. In the Weekly Times in Melbourne on the 28th of August 1920, the man-woman charge of murder, Fallini to stand trial. From an early hour on Thursday, August 19, a crowd was waiting outside the Central Police Court, Sydney, to hear evidence in connection with the charge against Eugenia Fallini, alias Harry Crawford, the man-woman, of having murdered Annie Burkett, with whom he lived as man and wife. Fallini was referred to as he throughout the proceedings. Mrs. Edith Hoyes of Drummoyne said she remembered Fallini coming to live next door to her. He had told her that his wife was addicted to drink. One day he said to her, "She has gone and taken everything and left me nothing." The witness had never seen Burkett drink. Ernest Bone, who said he was in business in Drummoyne, stated that Fallini in conversation said, "She has cleared out." Witness asked who he meant, and he said, "The missus. She goes out with other men." The witness said, "I do not think she is like that." And the accused answered, "Oh yes, she is. I have letters to prove it." He was very excited and smelt of drink. Witness had never seen Burkett drink any liquor. After several witnesses had been heard, Mr. Kidson for the prosecution called the daughter of the accused. She had to be assisted to the chair before the solicitor's table. She was wearing a navy blue costume, but her face was hidden by a thick black veil. She gave her name as Josephine Crawford Fallini and was crying the whole time she was giving evidence. Witness said she was not on very good terms with her mother, who had arguments with Mrs. Burkett about her. During the cross-examination, Mr. Kidson asked that Miss Fallini be treated as a hostile witness. Mr. Cohen for the defence objected, and Mr. Gale, who was on the bench, said he was very sorry for her. At a later stage, Mr. Gale said he would treat her as a hostile witness. The daughter's signed statement was made by Miss Fallini and handed as evidence. "As far as I can remember, I have been going under the name of De Anglis. I was brought up by Mrs. De Anglis of Pelham Street, Double Bay, whom I call Granny. She sent me to school when I was 5 years of age. I first went to the public school Double Bay and finally left when I was 12 years of age. I first remembered my mother when about 5 years of age. She used to visit Granny often and she always wore men's clothing and was known as Harry Crawford. Granny used to tell me that Harry Crawford was my mother and that my father was the captain of a boat. Granny also told me I was born at her house at Double Bay. My mother was very cruel to me when I was a child and used to frighten me. I lived with Granny until I was 14 years of age, when my Granny died. My mother then called on me at Double Bay and said, 'Have you got any money?' I then said no. She took me to the little confectionery shop in Darling Street, Balmain. The shop was kept by Mrs. Burkett, who had a son named Harry. My mother told me that Mrs. Burkett had some money and that Mrs. Burkett always thought that Mother was a man. I said to my mother, she'll find you out one of these days. But Mother said, oh, I'll watch it. I would rather do away with myself than let the police find out anything about me. Shortly afterwards, the next day I think it was, my mother took me to stay at Mrs. Keith's in Hoffman's Lane. I was later laid up and my mother used to visit me at St Margaret's home. I went back to Burkett's some time later and my mother told me to always call her father and not let Mrs. Burkett or anyone else know she was a woman. I did not know that my mother was married to Mrs. Burkett. Mother always called Mrs. Burkett Daisy. Mrs. Burkett always called my mother Harry. Later, Mrs. Burkett sold the business and we afterwards lived at Kogarah. Later, we went to Drummoyne. I have seen Mrs. Burkett drinking ale from a large bottle. My mother and Mrs. Burkett used to occupy the same bedroom. I always called my mother father. She and Mrs. Burkett used to quarrel a good deal and my mother used to come out and say, more rows over you. I answered my mother and she said, a lovely daughter I've got, and I said yes, and a lovely mother I've got. She took a silk shawl from me and gave it to Mrs. Burkett as a present. I left Burkett's in 1917 and went to live in Kent Street. Whilst employed as a packer at Parsons Brothers, I went out to Drummoyne to see my mother and found no one home. I was told at a grocer's shop that they did not know where my mother was. I later met my mother and she told me not to go and see Mrs. Burkett as she would go for me and that they were going to sell the place out. My mother told me that everything is unsettled now and upside down. Daisy has discovered I'm a woman. We are going to sell out and I am going my way and Daisy is going hers. I said to my mother, who has got the jewellery? My mother replied, oh, she's got all that. I forgot the date, but it was in 1917 and my mother seemed very agitated and upset. A few weeks later I met my mother, who said she was living at Annandale. I said, where is Mrs. Burkett? And she replied, I don't know, I think she is in service. I remember reading in the paper of a death of a woman and a body found at Chatswood about this time. I said to my mother, do you think the woman found was Daisy? She said, I don't know. She further said, oh, she might have got rid of herself. She drank a lot. I have only seen my mother on a few occasions since that date. When I met her in the street a few times, she never wanted to speak to me. I said to her on one occasion, where is Harry? She replied, oh, she has left him with me. What am I going to do with him? My mother used to smoke a lot and drink a great deal of whiskey. She was always reticent about herself and would tell me very little. Detective Sergeant Robson said he interviewed Fallini at the detective office, where she admitted that she was a woman. He then went with her to her residence in Stanmore, and the accused said, let me go in first. The witness refused, and Fallini said, don't let my wife see what is in that case. On opening the case, the witness found, among other articles, a revolver. 4 chambers were loaded and 2 had been discharged. At the conclusion of the evidence, Fallini, who pleaded not guilty and reserved her defence, was committed for trial. And in the Singleton Argus in New South Wales, on the 23rd of September 1920, the trial of Eugene Fallini on a charge of murdering Annie Burkett will commence at the Criminal Court on Monday. At Fallini's preliminary hearing and trial for murder at Darlinghurst Courthouse in October 1920, the man-woman case created a press sensation, with the accused appearing in the dock first in a man's suit and then in women's clothes. Fallini pleaded not guilty to the murder, but her alleged immorality in passing herself off as a man was made much of in the popular press, which portrayed her as a monster and a pervert. The Crown argued that Fallini had perpetrated sex fraud and had killed to cover her deception. The defence countered that she was innocent and merely a congenital invert. Eugene Fallini was convicted and condemned to death on the 6th of October 1920. Throughout the trial, Fallini maintained her innocence. When the jury took 2 hours to reach a verdict of guilty and the death sentence was passed, Fallini maintained in her low, resonant voice, "It is only through false evidence I have been convicted." Many a celebrated murder trial has had its origin in a trivial occurrence. When a set of false teeth were found on a mound at Chatswood, police little knew that the insignificant molars were to be the chief clue in unravelling a ghastly crime perpetrated by one of the most amazing murders in all criminal history in Australia, Eugene Fallini, the man-woman. On the 13th of November 1920, there was an appeal against the sentence, but it was rejected by the full court. It says, Sydney on Friday, Eugenia Fallini, known as the man-woman who is under sentence of death for the murder of Annie Burkett, appealed to the full court of criminal appeal today against her conviction and sentence. The application was unanimously refused. However, on Friday the 3rd of December 1920, at a meeting of the State Cabinet, the sentence of death passed on to Eugenia Fallini in the man-woman case was commuted to imprisonment for life. On the 15th of July 1929, Eugenia Fallini, review of amazing case. It is the intention of Mr. Lee, Minister for Justice, to have an inquiry made into the case of Eugenia Fallini in the Smiths Weekly in Sydney on the 8th of March 1930. Man-woman Eugenia Fallini makes appeal for freedom, tells her poignant story. Through this story flutters a little pink handkerchief, neatly ironed, carefully folded, delicate, and essentially feminine. It belongs to Eugenia Fallini. For nearly 10 long years, Eugenia Fallini has languished in Long Bay Penitentiary, a prisoner for the term of her natural life, a woman punished by society for a crime the whole circumstances of which shocked the public mind. Today, Eugenia Fallini, pink handkerchief in her gnarled hand, makes a humble, feminine gesture of entreaty. She beseeches her freedom. She does not want to die in jail. Nearly 60 years of age, this woman whose raven hair has turned by time to drab grey and on whose face 10 years of prison discipline have left an indelible mark, in whose grey eyes hope has given way to dull resignation, asks piteously to be allowed to see once more the streets, the shops, the lights, the bustle of civilization before she passes away and becomes one with Mother Earth. And whatever were the circumstances of Jean Fallini's crime 12.5 years ago, and the details were undoubtedly revolting, she is today undoubtedly a pathetic figure. She has been punished, she has suffered acutely, she is still suffering. Is authority willing to cry enough? Would it be wise to grant her freedom? Those associated with her have no doubt at all about the matter. Of Jean, as she is known in the women's section of the Long Bay Penitentiary, they speak about her in the highest terms. They speak of Jean Fallini as a model prisoner, as a woman who carries out in exemplary fashion the jobs allotted to her, who causes no trouble and against whose name no stone now can be cast. Jean has no enemies in Long Bay, no critics even. She is looked on only with an understanding sympathy. In recent months, Eugenia Fallini's mind has been greatly disturbed. She said, nearly 10 years ago I was convicted on circumstantial evidence. I did not have a chance. I have no education. I was what other people made me. The hand of the handkerchief trembles slightly and the deep-set eyes take on an appealing look. Please help me, said Jean. I do not want to die in this place. I have no friends, no money and no influence. I want my freedom. Eugenia Fallini, who says she'll be 60 years of age on July 24th, is a frail little woman. There is nothing strident or raucous about her. She is quiet, and with the 10 years of discipline ingrained in her, she is intensely obedient. In a dull, even voice, she told her story in disconnected fashion, groping every now and then for a word, skimming over some of the very embarrassing phases of her sordid story, living her life over again until the day she heard the judge pronounce her guilty of murder. For Jean Fallini lives in the past. The world ended for her in 1920. According to her statements, she was born in Leghorn and as an infant came with her parents to New Zealand. When she was 19, she married a man, Martello. As a young woman, she came to Australia with her daughter and went to live with Mrs. De Angeli in Double Bay. They became partners in a laundry business, but when Mrs. De Angeli died from dropsy, it was found that though she made a will, it was never signed and Jean got nothing. So she decided to adopt Marla Tyre because she thought she could do more work as a man than as a woman. She worked for Mr. Ritchie, who kept a hotel near Central Station, at the Pedrio Rubber Works, at the Meat Works Balmain and other places. She lost the little finger of her right hand at the Meat Works. As to the two women with whom, as Harry Crawford, went through a form of marriage, Jean did not speak at any length. They were older than I and they knew more than I did, she remarked tersely. One was Annie Burkett, a widow. We lived together at Drummoyne, said Jean, but she drank too much. Last I told her, I was not going out working while she stayed at home drinking, so she left in 1917. I did not see her. She took half her clothes and the furniture and things. I took her boy. Having regard to all the circumstances of her case, the plain indication of sexual aberration and the environment in which she had been brought up, she has dearly paid for her offence. That she is approaching old age and that it would be an act of grace to give her liberty. She is the only life-sentenced female prisoner at Long Bay. She frets. All she has in the world is a little grandchild at a Sydney orphanage. Her daughter died in 1924 and she longs to see the child. She reads a little, but her real hobby is gardening, and when there are any jobs such as painting to be done, she does them willingly. Jean will not go to prisoners' concerts. Sentimental songs upset her and it takes her days to recover. She dries her eyes with a little neatly ironed pink handkerchief and moves quietly under the grim archway, pausing for a few moments to speak to a black-robed nun, and the little figure of Eugenia Fallini with her pink handkerchief disappears through the iron gate. So a little less than 12 months later, Eugenia Fallini was released from Long Bay Prison. She'd done a total of 11 years, and when she was released, she assumed the name that she had taken on in the jail, which was Jean Ford, and she became the proprietor of a boarding house in Paddington, Sydney. On the 9th of June 1938, she just sold out of her boarding house and stepped off a pavement in front of a motor car in nearby Oxford Street and was hit. She died of her injuries on the following day in Sydney Hospital. One of the police officers engaged on the murder case, Detective Sergeant Watkins, took the dead woman's fingerprints in the hospital on Saturday morning. Fallini was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave at Rookwood Cemetery. And in the Burruan News, New South Wales, on the 17th of June 1938, street death of man-woman. Eugenia Fallini, the man-woman, central figure in one of the most sensational crimes in Australian history, was buried on Saturday. She died aged 64 following injuries when knocked down by a car in Paddington. Fallini was released from jail about 6 years ago. Since then, she's lived under the name of Mrs. Jean Ford. She undertook any employment that was offered after her release and moved from one locality to another. Evidently, police think to hide her identity. On Thursday, she completed the sale of a residential, which she maintained in Glenmore Road, Paddington, obtaining £100 for the goodwill. She had lived there for 3 months and none of her tenants knew her real name or history. A man who had been her business confidant for 4 years was astounded when he learned who Mrs. Ford was. She came to me whenever she conducted any business. She could neither read nor write and used to sign her documents with a mark. She told me bits about her past, but never mentioned the man-woman matter. In business dealings, she was scrupulously honest. She was tall and thin, very active, and weighed about 6 stone 7 pound. So Eugenia Fallini's family. Firstly, Annie Burkett. Well, Annie Burkett was born Annie Bell, and she was born on the 13th of May 1876 in Sydney. She married Harry Burkett in March 1903 in Darlinghurst, 2 months after their son Harry Bell Burkett was born. Harry was a salesman and 33, and Annie a nursery governess aged 27 when they married. Both of Annie's parents were deceased by the time she married Harry. Harry Burkett was born on the 21st of July 1869 in Northampton, England, and he died on the 11th of January 1906 at Newcastle, New South Wales, aged 36. At the time of his death, Harry was a tailor and owned his own business in West Newcastle. And there was an ad on the 4th of November 1905 advertising his business. Railway and tramway employees. Harry Burkett, Newcastle's best and cheapest tailor, will make your new suit better than any other tailor and you will save a sovereign on every suit. Harry Burkett, the People's Tailor, Hunter Street. And then his death notice, January the 11th at Newcastle, Harry Burkett, aged 36, English and South African papers, please copy. And what's interesting is that when the funeral notice was placed in the paper, it says Mr. Harry Burkett, but it says in brackets Mr. Harry Kruger Burkett are invited to attend his funeral. So I'm not sure of the link to South Africa. I have tried to have a little bit of a look. I'm wondering whether his mother possibly was South African. There was a memoriam for Harry And on Friday, the 11th of January, 1907, it says, Burkett, in memory of my beloved husband, Harry Burkett, who died at Newcastle on the 11th of January, 1906, peace, perfect peace, inserted by his loving wife, Daisy Burkett. And as we know, Harry Crawford called her Daisy, so it's quite likely that her family and her friends called her Daisy. And also, Annie's sister Lily placed in a memorial notice as well, in affectionate remembrance of my dear brother-in-law Harry Burkett, who died at Newcastle, inserted by his sister-in-law Lily Bell. So Harry Bell Burkett, Annie and Harry's son, was born on the 6th of January 1903 in Waverley, New South Wales. In August 1926, the engagement is announced between Harry B. Burkett of Stewart Street, Blakehurst, and Miss Phyllis Evelyn Hallman, fourth daughter of Mr. and Mrs. L. Hallman of Woodford Road, Banksia. Harry married Phyllis Hallman at Rockdale, New South Wales on the 4th of June 1927. Harry was a tailor cutter at the time of their marriage. On Harry's marriage certificate, he names his mother as Daisy Bell and his father as Harry Bell Burkett, and stated that Harry, his father, was a tailor. On the 12th of January 1929, it's announced that Harry and Phyllis have a son, Eric Keith, who was born at Nurse Fowler's Private Hospital in Rockdale. Eric married Valerie Colleen Stone in Sutherland in 1967. Eric was a teacher and they had 4 children, and he died in Taree in January 2011 at the age of 82. They had another son too, Harry John Burkett. He was a fitter and builder, and he married Rhea Corbett in Hurstville, New South Wales in 1957. And Harry Burkett died on the 18th of March 1980 at Hurstville Grove, New South Wales, aged 77. What became of Eugenia Fallini's daughter, Josephine Rita Fallini? Well, she was born on the 19th of September 1898 at Wallara, New South Wales. She married Arthur Raymond Whitby, a seaman who was later a postal officer, on the 18th of August 1920 at St Peters in New South Wales. Josephine listed only one parent on her marriage certificate, Lena Fallini. They had a daughter, Rita Josephine Whitby, in 1920. In 1922 in Burwood, a warrant was issued by the Burwood bench for the arrest of Arthur Raymond Whitby, charged with wife desertion. 25 years of age, 5'6", medium build, broad shoulders, dark complexion, brown hair and eyes, clean shaved, dressed in a grey tweed suit, black hat and black boots, a labourer, the complainant being Josephine Whitby of Heldon Hall, Heldon Street, Lakemba. And Josephine died on the 19th of December 1924, aged only 26, in East Sydney, in the Women's Hospital, Crown Street. It seems that they may have reunited, as in her death notice it says, Josephine Reader, beloved wife of Arthur Raymond Whitby. And when she was buried, the relatives and friends of Mr. Arthur Raymond Whitby of Darlington Street, Darlington, are kindly invited to attend the funeral of his beloved wife, Josephine Rita. Josephine and Arthur's daughter, Rita, so Eugenia Fallini's granddaughter, had been in a convent at Narellan. She married Thomas Elvey in October 1950 in Sydney. Thomas was a driver and Rita a machinist at the time of their marriage, and they had a daughter, Carol Josephine Elvey, in June 1953 in Paddington. Rita died in June 1995 in Paddington at the age of 65, and Carol died in Tenterfield on the 7th of August 2014, aged 61, and Carol had 5 children. So the amazing story of Eugenia Fallini and the many names that she took on as her guise of a man throughout her life.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.